A father is fighting for his life in the ICU, while his only son posts wedding photos online bragging, "New beginnings, finally free." The cruelty is staggering, the kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any wound. He paid for the son's Harvard degree, the Tesla, the condo. Yet in his darkest hour, not a single visit, only a smiling photo op for strangers to like. Blood alone does not make family loyalty, does. Viewers, what would you do if this was your child? Subscribe for more shocking stories and comment where in America you're watching from. The truth only gets darker. He built the empire from nothing. Brick by brick, sleepless night after sleepless night. The man had poured 23 years of his life into a $4.2 million tech company that became the pride of Silicon Valley. Every milestone had carried his fingerprints, the nights he coded alone in the garage while eating cold pizza, the early mornings when he mortgaged his house to make payroll, the weekends sacrificed when others enjoyed family barbecues. All of it, he told himself, was for his son's future. He thought the company would become a legacy, a bridge between generations, a crown he could place proudly on his son's head. The sacrifices weren't measured only in revenue or stock valuations. They came in personal currency. He paid every tuition bill without hesitation from grade school through Harvard. He funded a 6-figure MBA so his son could stand shoulder to shoulder with America's elite. He wired money for the Tesla the boy demanded just to keep him happy, and bought him a sleek downtown condo because anything less would have seemed beneath the family name. He'd been both father and financier, protector and benefactor, feeding every dream his son dared to have. And now, as he lay broken in the ICU, the reality of abandonment pressed against his chest harder than the oxygen mask. The hospital clock ticked with cruel precision. Each second echoed with a question he refused to voice. How had all those years of devotion turned into silence when he needed love most? The emergency contact records were brutal proof. 17 unanswered calls. No visits logged. No message of concern. The son who was supposed to carry his name forward was instead carrying champagne flutes, smiling for cameras, and hashtagging finally free. The sting was sharper than any surgical scar. He remembered Christmas dinners where he carved the turkey with pride, watching his boy unwrap gifts paid for by 18-hour workdays. He remembered the look on his son's face when he handed over the keys to the Tesla, the excitement so pure, it almost erased the exhaustion behind his own eyes. He remembered standing on the Harvard campus lawn, clapping until his hands ached as his son walked across the stage in cap and gown, believing it was the start of a dynasty. Those memories now collapsed under the weight of betrayal. Each one felt like a debt he'd paid to a bank that had no intention of honoring the account. But in the ICU, clarity comes in strange doses. The machines hummed a steady rhythm that almost felt like a countdown. And in that silence, he began to see the truth with cinematic sharpness. Family wasn't defined by last names on legal forms or genetic resemblance in the mirror. Family was forged in loyalty carved by the hands that showed up when it mattered. The contrast was blinding. While his son vanished into a world of tuxedo fittings and wine tastings, his employees were the ones standing vigil. Patricia, the CFO, had been there every dawn, whispering updates about projects into his unconscious ears, as if her voice could tether him back to the world. Maria, the facilities manager, carried soup in dented thermoses and prayed beside him with calloused hands that had scrubbed his offices for 15 years. Tommy, the developer, dragged his laptop into the ICU and coded beside his silent body, filling the sterile room with the tap of loyalty disguised as keystrokes. These weren't acts of obligation. They were offerings of devotion. They came without inheritance attached, without the promise of payout. They came because these people had recognized him not just as a boss, but as the man who gave them chances when no one else would. In their presence, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a reminder that respect isn't purchased, it's earned. The betrayal of his son cut deep, but the revelation cut deeper. His empire, once imagined as a family inheritance, was never meant to be handed to someone who saw it as an ATM. It was meant to belong to those who had breathed life into it alongside him. He thought of the hours Patricia had spent balancing numbers to keep the company afloat, of Maria's quiet sacrifices to protect the building as if it were her own home, of Tommy's genius that had built the algorithms defining their competitive edge. Each of them had invested more than his son ever had. And each of them had given something money could never buy: loyalty. He lay still, the dim light of the ICU reflecting against the monitor screens, but in his mind a storm was building. The past 23 years replayed like a montage in his memory. But now he saw it differently. The photos of vacations, the checks written for extravagant purchases, the dinners where his son rolled his eyes at modest furniture or out-of-date suits, these weren't moments of bonding. They were receipts of entitlement. His son had never wanted to inherit a legacy. He had only wanted to inherit control. And control without sacrifice was nothing more than theft. The thought made him clench his fist against the starched sheets. The room around him might have smelled of antiseptic, and the air might have been filled with the mechanical hum of machines, but inside his chest burned a new clarity. He had built his empire on blueprints, contracts, and code. He knew better than anyone that foundations matter. And if the foundation of his family had rotted with greed, then it was time to rebuild. His pulse monitor flickered a steady beep, marking every realization. He wasn't just a patient anymore, he was a strategist preparing for war. A war not of shouting or fists, but of signatures, amendments, and decisions that would echo long after he was gone. The irony was cinematic. While his son posted about freedom on social media, the father was preparing to give him exactly that freedom from every dollar, every share, every asset he thought he deserved. The IV dripped, the machines clicked, and he allowed himself a bitter smile. He had been blind for too long, but 7 days in this bed had given him sharper vision than 23 years of sacrifice. The next act of his story would not be written with sentiment. It would be written with steel, with a pen, with the cold precision of a man who finally understood the difference between love and loyalty. And what waited beyond that realization would shake not only his son's world, but the entire company that bore his name. The stage was set, the audience unwittingly gathered, and the curtain was about to rise on a reckoning no one would forget. The nurse thought she was being kind when she held out the phone, her voice soft, almost cheerful. She scrolled through photos of the son in a custom tuxedo, champagne glass in hand, flashing a smile that could have been mistaken for joy if not for the caption beneath it. New beginnings, finally free. The nurse chuckled gently, unaware of the blade she'd just driven deeper. She whispered, "Your son looks so happy." He didn't flinch, didn't lash out. He simply nodded as though the photos were just another set of lab results, another clinical update, another line in a medical chart. But inside, the humiliation burned with surgical precision. His fight for life had been reduced to a footnote, a distraction from a party. The weight of it settled over him like lead. Here he was, tethered to machines, lungs kept alive by plastic tubes, veins carrying medication that smelled faintly of metal, while his only child broadcasted freedom to the world. Freedom from what? From responsibility, from love, from the father who had built every brick of the life he now flaunted. The heartbreak wasn't just the abandonment, it was the revelation that his existence had become an inconvenience in someone else's narrative. A medical drama, as if the story of his life could be reduced to a subplot in the son's celebration. He turned his gaze to the ceiling, its sterile tiles arranged like squares of wasted time. In those tiles he saw fragments of memory. Nights when he had skipped meals to pay for tuition. Mornings when he slipped envelopes of cash into his son's hand without asking questions, just to make sure there was never a moment of lack. Weekends when he sat alone in an office drafting contracts while his boy spent money faster than he could earn it. Those sacrifices had been invisible currency. And now, seeing them erased in the glow of a wedding photo, he felt stripped bare, as if the monitors beeping around him were mocking reminders that loyalty had never been part of the deal. But humiliation has a strange way of sharpening the senses. As he studied those photos again, something shifted. His heartbreak, once heavy, began to crystallize into something colder, something steadier. Betrayal had a taste metallic and unforgettable, and he could feel it on his tongue. If his son saw his struggle as an inconvenient backdrop, then perhaps it was time to rewrite the script entirely. He had been cast as the dying father in a hospital bed, but the role he was preparing to play now was very different. The nurse left the room humming, unaware of the storm building in her patient's chest. Alone again, he studied the IV bag above him, clear liquid dripping at precise intervals, each drop echoing like a countdown. It wasn't just medicine, it was time. Every drop reminded him that he was still here, still capable, still dangerous if he chose to be. And the son who thought this was over had no idea what kind of story was about to unfold. The phone rested on the bedside table. With effort, he reached for it, his fingers trembling from weakness, not hesitation. The screen glowed in the dim light, a portal to both the betrayal and the revenge. Scrolling back through the photos, he examined them with forensic detail. The son's grin at the bachelor party, the sparkle of his fiancée's diamond bracelet, the lavish banquet table lined with crystal glasses and floral arrangements that must have cost more than some employees made in a year. Every photo was evidence, every post a confession. The world didn't see it, but he did. A timeline of neglect cataloged in pixels. He saved each image, creating a folder with a name he knew would sting later. Receipts, because that's what they were, proof that while loyal hands sat by his bedside, his own blood celebrated without pause. The machines continued their monotone chorus, steady and unfeeling, but he felt a rising current in his chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity, sharpened by the contrast of loyalty and betrayal. He thought of Patricia, the CFO who had carried the company on her shoulders for nearly 2 decades. He pictured Maria, whose prayers in Spanish had filled the sterile room with warmth no machine could replicate. He imagined Tommy hunched over a laptop coding lines of devotion into existence while his leader slept between breaths. These people had no obligation, no inheritance waiting. They gave because they cared, and that made their presence louder than his son's absence. The humiliation no longer felt like defeat. It began to feel like fuel. His eyes, dry from the hospital air, narrowed at the thought of what came next. He had lived long enough to know that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, hidden in signatures, in quiet decisions made when no one is looking. The son thought he had already won, that the inheritance was inevitable, that the empire was his by birthright. But the father understood something his son never would. Empires aren't inherited. They're built, defended, and when necessary, rebuilt without mercy. He closed the folder of screenshots and opened another app, the legal one. The irony wasn't lost on him that it sat untouched for years, like a loaded weapon left in a drawer. His thumb hovered over the icon, the beeping monitor in the background, counting down like a metronome of destiny. Not tonight, he thought. Not yet. Timing mattered, and revenge deserved precision. He let the phone fall back to the table, its glow fading into darkness. The hallway outside was quiet, nurses' shoes squeaking faintly against polished floors. Somewhere a patient moaned, another machine alarmed, life and death intertwining in mechanical rhythm. He turned his head toward the faint reflection in the window, an older man, gaunt from illness but eyes sharp as blades. He didn't see weakness anymore. He saw a strategist, a survivor, a man who understood that heartbreak could be weaponized. His chest rose and fell with deliberate slowness as he whispered to himself, almost a vow. If blood has failed me, loyalty will define me. And with that promise, the father knew that the betrayal splashed across social media was not the end. It was only the prologue. What followed would not be a reconciliation. It would be a reckoning measured not in tears, but in decisions so precise, so final, that the son would never forget the price of turning his father's life into background noise. The stage was ready. The audience didn't know it yet. And the curtain was just beginning to rise. They came without fanfare, without obligation, and without the hollow expectation of inheritance. The employees walked into the ICU with coffee cups in trembling hands, thermoses of homemade soup still steaming, and the kind of prayers that rose not from duty, but from genuine affection. They sat in silence beside his bed, sometimes whispering words of encouragement, sometimes just watching his chest rise and fall in sync with the machines. To outsiders, they looked like family because in every way that mattered they were. Each visit was a quiet testimony to the life he had built not through blood, but through loyalty and trust. Their presence drew the starkest contrast against the absence of his son, an emptiness so loud it rattled louder than the heart monitor's steady beeps. Patricia, his CFO, was always first. She arrived before dawn, her worn briefcase clutched like armor. She'd sit near the bed, flipping through spreadsheets, reading aloud small victories from the office. Revenue up 2% this quarter, a new contract signed in Denver, a patent approved. She pretended it was business as usual, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the truth. She wasn't talking to a boss, she was talking to a man she refused to lose. When she thought he was asleep, she would rest her hand on his and whisper, "You built this for all of us. We're not letting go." Then came Maria, the facilities manager. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and fixing broken tiles, but she carried grace into the room. She lit a candle in the chapel downstairs before every visit, and returned with her hair damp from holy water she brushed across her forehead. She prayed in Spanish, her voice low and steady, asking for strength not just for him, but for herself, for the company, for every family his decisions had kept afloat. She left bowls of caldo de pollo on the bedside table, even though she knew he couldn't eat yet. The smell filled the sterile room with warmth, cutting through the antiseptic sting that clung to the air. Tommy, the developer, was different. He brought his laptop always open, fingers moving furiously across the keyboard. He said little, but the sound of code being written was his prayer. He kept the company servers running from that chair, loyal as a soldier refusing to leave his post. Once during a late-night shift, he leaned closer to the bed and muttered, "Don't you dare check out on us, boss. We still need your brain to clean up my messy code." It was a joke, but his voice cracked on the last word. Other faces came too. The receptionist who had started as an intern, the janitor who remembered when the office had only 2 desks and a coffee pot, the head of marketing who had carried the brand on her back through 3 recessions. They rotated like a watch, ensuring the bed was never empty, ensuring he was never truly alone. Their loyalty became a chorus that drowned out the silence left by his son. Every gesture, every prayer, every late-night vigil under fluorescent lights was a reminder of who valued him most. He watched it all with eyes half-shuttered, his body weak, but his mind wide awake. Each visit cut deeper, not because of the comfort they offered, but because of the comparison it forced. His son, the heir he had sacrificed everything to raise, had not stepped foot inside the hospital. Not once. The cruelty of that absence pressed down like weight on his chest. He imagined his son raising a toast at some rehearsal dinner, the clink of glasses ringing while here in the ICU, the sound of loyalty came in softer notes, the scrape of a chair pulled closer, the whisper of a prayer, the clatter of a keyboard coding another line into their shared future. The father realized that bloodlines were fragile, easily severed by greed, but loyalty was forged in fire. He thought of the empire he had built and wondered if he had mistaken legacy for entitlement. His employees had shown him what true legacy looked like. It wasn't the son's name on the company letterhead or the photos splashed across social media. It was Patricia losing sleep to keep the books clean, Maria praying through cracked lips for his health, Tommy tethering himself to a laptop so the company heartbeat never faltered. That was legacy. That was family. At night, when the hospital grew quiet and the fluorescent lights flickered above, he would hear the soft rustle of someone shifting in the visitor's chair. Sometimes it was Patricia reviewing contracts by the glow of her phone. Sometimes Maria murmuring prayers until her voice went hoarse. sometimes Tommy asleep upright with his laptop balanced precariously on his knees. The father stared at them with an ache that was equal parts gratitude and rage. Gratitude for the devotion they offered so freely, and rage that his own son had offered nothing at all. The humiliation of abandonment had begun to transform into something sharper. Each act of loyalty was like steel being hammered into shape, reforging his resolve. These people had given him everything his son refused: presence, respect, love without condition. He would not let that truth go unanswered. On the 7th night, when the ICU hallway was empty and the machines whispered their endless rhythm, he made a decision. His son's absence had not weakened him, it had revealed him. The empire would not fall into the hands of someone who saw his father's suffering as background noise. The empire would belong to those who had already proven themselves worthy. He closed his eyes, listening to the soft sound of Tommy's typing, and let a thought settle like a vow. The next time the pen touched paper, it would not write another check for his son's indulgence. It would rewrite destiny itself. And with that vow came a quiet thrill, an almost cinematic pulse of anticipation. Because betrayal may have left him bleeding, but loyalty had given him the weapon he needed. The curtain was rising, and the next act would change everything. The hospital administrator brought the printout as if it were nothing more than another routine form. But to him, it was a verdict. 17 calls. Each one stamped with the desperate urgency of a life hanging by a thread. 17 pleas sent into the void, unanswered, unacknowledged. He stared at the paper, the ink smudged where his trembling fingers pressed too hard, and felt the weight of truth settle in his chest, heavier than any illness. 17 calls could not be explained away as bad reception or a busy schedule. 17 calls meant choice. His son had chosen silence. The confirmation burned worse than the tubes in his arms. For years he had suspected it in fleeting moments, when the requests for money overshadowed the words of affection, when the thanks sounded rehearsed, when the hugs felt like transactions. But he had buried those suspicions under excuses. He's stressed, he's young, he'll grow into responsibility. Now the paper in his hands mocked every excuse. It was proof written in numbers, hard and undeniable. Money meant more than blood inheritance, meant more than loyalty, and family had been reduced to an account balance waiting to be collected. He closed his eyes and saw memories twisted in cruel new light. The Christmas morning when his son had asked not for time together, but for a new watch that cost more than most people's yearly rent. The summer when a family trip to Yellowstone was cut short because his son demanded they return early to attend a networking event. The graduation handshake where instead of gratitude there was already another request for tuition to cover an additional certification. All of it, every sacrifice, now revealed itself for what it had been: installments in a contract he had never agreed to, payments on a bond that would never mature into love. The silence of those unanswered calls echoed louder than the machines in his room. He pictured the phone buzzing on some marble countertop, ignored while his son raised glasses of champagne and rehearsed wedding vows. Each buzz was another chance to choose loyalty, and each time he had chosen luxury. The father's hand clenched the record tighter until his knuckles blanched. Betrayal was no longer an abstract wound. It was quantified, documented, filed into the hospital's system like any other statistic. But this statistic carved itself into his bones. He imagined what his employees would say if they knew. Patricia would grit her teeth, hiding her fury behind her professional mask. Maria would whisper prayers, her voice shaking with disbelief. Tommy would slam his laptop shut and mutter curses under his breath. They would all see the truth as clearly as he did now. The heir he had poured millions into was nothing but an empty suit stitched together with entitlement. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to sync with the rage building inside him, each tone sharper, faster. He had built a company by reading data, identifying patterns, and predicting outcomes. This was no different. 17 unanswered calls formed a pattern, and the outcome was certain. His son wasn't waiting for him to recover. His son was waiting for him to die, and to die quietly so the transfer of wealth could proceed without interruption. But the father was not dead. Not yet. And silence, he realized, can be answered. It doesn't need words. It needs action. He placed the record back on the tray table beside his bed and stared at it, as if it were a blueprint. Every empire has a moment when its future must be redefined. This was his. The document wasn't just proof of betrayal. It was a map pointing him toward what needed to be done. He had been given clarity, brutal and undeniable. And with clarity comes resolve. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its sound hollow in the sterile quiet. He thought about the years ahead, about how long he might have if he survived this bed. A year, 5, 10, enough, he decided. Enough to make sure the company and his legacy did not rot in the hands of someone who had abandoned him 17 times in a single night. He could almost hear his son's voice, rehearsed and shallow, delivering excuses. "I didn't see the calls. I was busy. It was bad timing." Lies layered on lies, but no lie could erase the fact that loyalty is measured in presence, not inheritance. And his son had failed the test before the exam had even begun. The father's eyes hardened, a steel glint breaking through the haze of exhaustion. He would not beg again. He would not call again. He would not spend another second hoping for a loyalty that did not exist. The next move belonged to him, and it would not be made with pleas or unanswered rings. It would be made with the kind of finality only a signature could deliver. Somewhere in the distance, laughter filtered through from the hospital lobby, the echo of another family visiting another son who showed up. It stung, but it also fueled him. He would not envy them. He would not wallow in what he had lost. He would take what remained, his mind, his will, his empire, and forge something indestructible from the shards of betrayal. The 17 calls no longer haunted him. They liberated him. They stripped away illusion, leaving nothing but the truth. He owed his son nothing. Not another dollar. Not another excuse. Not another chance. And in that liberation he felt a dark thrill pulse through his veins. He might be confined to this bed, but he was not powerless. The game had just shifted, and the son who thought silence was victory had no idea that silence had just signed away his future. The night deepened. The machines continued their steady chorus, and the father's eyes remained fixed on the record. To anyone else, it was paper. To him, it was prophecy. And the story it foretold was not one of reconciliation. It was one of reckoning. The next move was already forming in his mind, sharp and precise. And when it came, it would erase 17 unanswered calls with a single irreversible decision. The security footage played in grainy black and white, time-stamped with cruel precision. Every frame was a confession, every second a reminder of who showed up and who didn't. The employees appeared in shifts, slipping into the ICU like clockwork, their loyalty unfolding in quiet, relentless cycles. Patricia arriving just after dawn, her silhouette hunched as she carried files under her arm. Maria settling into the chair at noon, her lips moving in prayer, a rosary glinting faintly in the fluorescent light. Tommy at midnight, laptop open, coding with the intensity of a soldier on guard. Their vigil was steady, seamless, as if rehearsed, but it wasn't duty. It was devotion. The cameras captured it all, the unbroken chain of loyalty that wrapped around him when his own blood had abandoned him. Then came the other footage, the one that burned like acid on his skin. Across town, his son spun through nights of indulgence, the tuxedo-fitting champagne flute in hand, smirking at his reflection in a $3,000 mirror. The wine tasting at a vineyard 2 hours away, his fiancée clinking glasses with bridesmaids while he laughed about vintage notes as though betrayal had a flavor. The bachelor party stretched across multiple cities, each post more grotesque than the last, rooftop bars, neon lights, private lounges where loyalty was traded for applause. The timeline laid them side by side. At 11:17 p.m., Tommy adjusted the blanket on his boss's frail body. At 11:17 p.m., his son raised a toast over bourbon, shouting into the night that his life was just beginning. At 3:42 a.m., Maria pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, whispering prayers to saints. At 3:42 a.m., his son stumbled into a limousine, laughter slurring into the darkness. The contrast was so sharp it felt surgical. Betrayal wasn't an abstract idea anymore, it was carved into time itself, a permanent scar etched across the hospital's digital archives. He studied those frames with a stillness that was more dangerous than rage. Each clip was a blade, and together they forged a weapon. The employees didn't know they were being recorded. Their loyalty was pure unperformed. They didn't seek recognition. They didn't post it online. They simply showed up because they understood that loyalty doesn't need an audience. His son, on the other hand, performed his freedom for the world, every indulgence documented, every laugh captured, every absence magnified by the glow of a camera. The father let the footage play again, slower this time, imprinting the timeline into his mind. He wanted to remember every detail, every timestamp. This wasn't just evidence of betrayal. It was fuel, the kind that would drive every decision that came next. He had lived his life studying patterns, identifying flaws, predicting outcomes. And here the pattern was undeniable. Loyalty was found in unexpected places, and betrayal was always loud enough to reveal itself. As the hours bled into dawn, he lay in the sterile bed with the footage looping silently on the monitor beside him. The machines hummed in rhythm with his thoughts, and for the first time in days, his lips curved into something resembling a smile. Not of joy, but of resolve. If his son believed the inheritance was guaranteed, these tapes had already written another ending. Legacy was not about blood. It was about presence, sacrifice, and the unseen acts that defined a man's worth. He closed his eyes, the images still seared into his mind. Patricia whispering into the early light. Maria praying into the afternoon hush. Tommy coding through the night. And his son celebrating a freedom he hadn't earned. The world believed weddings were beginnings. But here in the cold glow of security footage, he knew this wedding would mark something else entirely. Not the start of a family, but the beginning of a reckoning that would end one. The next move was inevitable. The stage was set, the roles already cast. And when the curtain rose, the son would learn that every timestamp carried a consequence, and every moment of absence would be paid for in full. The call came in the middle of the night, a shrill vibration that cut through the hum of the ICU like a blade. For a moment he thought against all logic that it might be his son calling to ask how he was holding on, to say he was sorry, to promise he'd come in the morning. But when he answered, the voice on the other end was brisk, distracted, like a man running down a list. $37,000 for catering, he said first, as if reading a grocery receipt. $23,000 for the flowers, $15,000 for the photographer. The numbers came one after another, crisp and cold, like bullets tearing through any last illusion that this was a call born of love. The father lay still, the oxygen mask pressing against his face, listening as his son itemized expenses for a wedding that sounded less like a celebration and more like a hostile takeover. Not once did he ask, "How are you?" Not once did he lower his voice to whisper words of comfort. The only thing alive in his tone was urgency over bills, contracts, deposits that couldn't wait. Every syllable confirmed what the father had already begun to accept, but now felt carved in stone. His existence meant less than a centerpiece, less than a band's encore, less than a table of canapes nobody would remember a week later. He closed his eyes, and in the silence between the numbers, he could almost hear the machines in the background mocking him. Beep for every hour spent building a company. Beep for every dollar funneled into tuition and apartments. Beep for every sleepless night he'd carried the weight of 2 lives. And now his reward was a demand for $37,000 more. The total echoed in his mind, absurd and grotesque. $37,000 could have paid for new research equipment in the ICU, could have bought ventilators, could have kept the company's junior staff employed for months. But to his son, it was simply the price of a menu. Humiliation pressed down heavier than the sheets. This wasn't just neglect, it was exploitation, bold and shameless. The call revealed the heart of the matter. His son saw him not as a father, not even as a man, but as an endless account, a vault to be cracked open on demand. And for the first time, the father felt no sorrow. What filled him instead was something sharper, steadier. Betrayal stripped of its sting, transformed into clarity. He let the voice drone on, nodding faintly, though his son couldn't see. He gave no answer, no confirmation, just let the words settle into memory. He wanted to remember this moment exactly, every tone, every figure, because it was the moment the scales tipped forever. There would be no forgiveness, no return to illusions. There would only be action. When the line finally clicked dead, the father lay staring at the ceiling, his pulse steady, his breath shallow but even. The silence afterward was louder than the call itself, louder than the list of numbers. For the first time in years, his mind was utterly clear. His son had asked for $37,000 for catering. Instead, he would give him nothing, less than nothing. He would take back everything he had ever assumed was promised. He thought of Patricia's hand gripping his as she whispered that the company still needed him. He thought of Maria's rosary shining under fluorescent lights. He thought of Tommy coding through exhaustion while others slept. They hadn't asked for a dime. They hadn't demanded anything but his survival. And suddenly the contrast was unbearable. Loyalty costs nothing, yet it was priceless. Betrayal had cost him millions, yet it was worthless. He reached for the folder by his bed, the one his attorney had dropped off discreetly at his request. His hands shook as he opened it, not from weakness, but from anticipation. Legal language stared back at him, clauses and amendments waiting for a signature. He traced the pen across the paper, though he wasn't ready to sign yet. Timing mattered. Precision mattered. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about legacy. And legacies are carved in deliberate strokes, not impulsive rage. Outside the window, the city glowed with the restless lights of lives carrying on, oblivious to the reckoning being born in this sterile room. Somewhere across that skyline, his son was drinking champagne, rehearsing vows, ordering more flowers. He had no idea the call he had just made had shifted everything. No idea that his father had transformed in the space of a single conversation. No longer the benefactor, no longer the silent provider. Now he was the architect of a new ending. The father rested the pen on the paper and let his hand fall. His strength would return. His will was iron. And when the time came to strike, it would be with the kind of precision no one could undo. His son had asked for $37,000. What he would get instead was a lesson worth $4 million. The next sunrise crept through the blinds, soft gold spilling across the bed. The father's eyes opened sharper than they had been in days. The game had changed. The curtain was rising on a new act, and when it fell, it would not be the wedding that people remembered. It would be the reckoning that followed. The truth settled over him like frost. It wasn't a question anymore, not a suspicion lurking in the background. His son cared about timing, about when the last breath would free the vault, not about survival, not about whether the man who had built his future lived another day. That kind of clarity didn't come with fire or rage, it came with ice. Cold, sharp, steady. He lay there in the hospital bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles, and in that moment he understood that the will, once written with love and hope, had become a weapon pointed at his own chest. It had to be rewritten. He pictured the original document, neat and binding, every line crafted to secure a future for a boy who never planned to earn it. $4 million in asset shares in the company, the house with its sprawling garden, the vacation property tucked away by the lake. All of it laid out like a feast prepared for a son who now salivated over the timing of his father's death. That document had been built on faith. Faith that blood meant loyalty. Faith that sacrifice would be remembered. Faith that a son would one day look back and honor the man who made him. But faith was for fools, and he was done being one. The will was no longer a gift. It was leverage. It was judgment. It was a ledger that needed correction not in ink, but in fire. The signatures of lawyers and notaries could sanctify betrayal, but it was still betrayal, and betrayal demanded a response. He imagined the moment of rewriting, the stroke of the pen that would cut his son out of the future like a surgeon excising rot. He saw Patricia's name in the margins, her loyalty honored with more than words. He saw Maria's years of devotion translated into security she had never dared to dream of. He saw Tommy, the quiet sentinel, receiving the chance to build not just code, but a legacy of his own. These were the heirs he had overlooked, the family he had underestimated. They had proven what mattered when the Empire's foundation shook. They had chosen presence over profit, loyalty over inheritance. The father's mind sharpened with every passing second. He began to calculate, to strategize, not just in terms of money, but in terms of message. The will was more than a redistribution of assets, it would be the final lesson. A son who valued inheritance more than survival would inherit nothing but a warning carved into legal stone. A warning to the world that blood is not sacred, that legacy belongs to the loyal. He let the thought linger, savoring the irony. While his son rehearsed vows and raised glasses, believing the empire already his, the foundation was being pulled out from under him. He didn't know that every cruel absence, every unanswered call, every demand for money had already written him out. The reckoning wouldn't come with shouting or confrontation. It would come in silence, with the sound of a pen sliding across paper, the ink drying into permanence. The father closed his eyes and saw the future unfold. The wedding collapsing under unpaid bills, the panic when creditors came knocking, the humiliation when whispers spread that the empire wasn't his to inherit. And then the final blow, the reading of a will that no longer crowned him as heir, but left him stripped, exposed, a man with nothing but his own greed for company. The image brought a grim satisfaction, not because of revenge, but because of justice. The machines around him hummed with steady rhythm, a chorus that seemed to affirm his resolve. For days he had felt powerless, tethered to wires and tubes, dependent on nurses and prayers. Now, even in weakness, he felt stronger than he had in years. Power wasn't in muscle or health, it was in choice. And he still had the power to choose. The decision was made, but the execution would require precision. He would need his lawyer discreet and loyal. He would need to act quickly before the sun caught wind of his shift. Timing was everything, and in this war, timing would be his weapon. He thought of the folders that waited in the attorney's office, of the amendments that could be drafted in hours, of the signatures that could change the course of generations. All it required was his will, not just the document, but the force inside him that refused to be broken. The night stretched long, the hospital quiet, except for the shuffle of nurses in soft shoes. He stared at the shadows on the wall, imagining the ink already dry, imagining the son's face when the truth arrived. The thought didn't warm him, didn't ease the ache in his chest, but it steadied him. He had been betrayed, humiliated, discarded. Now he would become the author of the final chapter, the one his son could never rewrite. The decision was more than survival. It was legacy sharpened and redefined. The father would not be remembered as a man who gave blindly until there was nothing left. He would be remembered as a man who chose justice in the face of betrayal, who placed loyalty above blood, who used his last strength not to cling, but to carve truth into the future. He let the thought settle into his bones, colder and sharper than any pain the ICU could deliver. The will would be rewritten, and with that stroke of a pen the balance of power would shift forever. And beyond that signature a storm waited, ready to break. He let his mind drift back through the years, not to birthdays or holidays, not to the milestones that most fathers would cherish, but to the faces of those who had stood beside him in the trenches of creation. Patricia came first to memory, the CFO who had been with him nearly 2 decades. He saw her as she was on the first day, nervous but sharp, clutching a calculator like a weapon, ready to fight off the chaos of a young startup. For 19 years she had balanced the books, stretched dollars until they screamed, defended the company in boardrooms packed with wolves. When vendors threatened to walk, it was Patricia who held the line. When the IRS came sniffing, it was Patricia who shielded him with meticulous records, saving him from ruin. She never asked for glory, never demanded a raise beyond reason. Her devotion was carved not in words, but in numbers that always added up, even when the odds said they shouldn't. Maria's memory followed, warm and grounding. 15 years of loyalty, though most people never noticed her. She was the keeper of the floors, the walls, the building itself. She patched leaks, polished marble, changed light bulbs at midnight when conferences threatened to collapse under darkness. But her devotion was deeper than mops and paint. He remembered the winter she pawned her jewelry to buy space heaters when the old system failed, making sure employees could keep working without freezing. He remembered the way she baked loaves of bread and left them in the break room, whispering in Spanish that people worked better with full stomachs. Maria was never on the payroll for strategy, but she had been the quiet strategist of morale. She cared not because of a paycheck, but because the company had become her home, and he had become part of her family. Then came Tommy. 12 years younger than Patricia and Maria, he had walked into the office with shaggy hair, sneakers untied, and a laptop under his arm. What he lacked in polish, he made up for in brilliance. He built code like other men built monuments. When investors demanded prototypes, it was Tommy's hands that delivered them at dawn, his eyes bloodshot but blazing with pride. When servers crashed, it was Tommy who slept on the floor until they were rebuilt. He lived half his life in that office, fueled by energy drinks and a devotion that couldn't be manufactured. The father recalled nights when Tommy argued with him like a son, challenging decisions, pushing for innovation, always fighting for the company's survival, as if it were his own creation. These weren't employees, they were pillars. They were the scaffolding that had kept the empire from collapsing, the unseen hands that had shaped every victory. When he thought of family now, it wasn't bloodlines or inheritance that came to mind. It was them. Patricia, who had guarded his empire with numbers sharper than blades. Maria, who had held the walls together with faith and sweat. Tommy, who had written the DNA of the company line by line like scripture. The father felt his chest tighten, not with weakness, but with a fierce kind of pride. They had given more than his son ever had, more than his son ever would. His son had inherited every advantage, every privilege, yet gave nothing in return. These three had started with nothing, taken the scraps of his vision, and built something eternal. They had shown what loyalty meant, not in words, not in promises, but in presence. They had stood beside his hospital bed when blood did not. They had shown up when family didn't. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, and he began to imagine their futures. Patricia, tired from years of carrying ledgers heavier than her frame, finally free to lead without fear of collapse. Maria, her hands calloused but steady, finally secure enough to rest, to live without worrying if the roof above her head would hold. Tommy, still young, still burning with ideas, finally given the chance to lead projects of his own, to shape not just code, but destiny. He saw them all, not as workers, but as heirs. Not as employees, but as family reborn. The father's heart beat slower, steadier, like a drum preparing for a march. The decision was already written in his bones. Legacy would not belong to the ungrateful son who measured love in bank transfers. It would belong to those who had already proven their worth in hours, sweat, prayers, and code. The will would carry their names. The future would carry their fingerprints. He thought of the day his son would discover it, the day when the attorney's voice would echo in a hushed room, reading names he had never expected to hear. Patricia, Maria, Tommy. The shock, the outrage, the humiliation, it would all be carved into his son's face. And in that moment, truth would be undeniable. Blood had failed, but loyalty had triumphed. The father let the vision settle, sharper than any dream, colder than any fear. He wasn't done yet. The reckoning was still being written, and each loyal name was a line in a new story. What came next would not just shift inheritance, it would redefine family forever. The despair that had anchored him for days began to loosen its grip, replaced by something harder, sharper, alive. He asked for a pen. The nurse thought it was a strange request, but she handed one over, her brows creased with curiosity. His hands trembled at first, weak from tubes and needles, but the weight of the pen steadied him more than any IV drip. He pulled the legal folder closer, its paper crisp and heavy, the scent of ink carrying the gravity of finality. This wasn't paperwork anymore. This was a blade. Every stroke would cut deeper than words, deeper than arguments, deeper than any confrontation his son had dared avoid. He began to draft the new will, his mind clear with a precision only betrayal could deliver. The company shares once intended to crown an heir were divided into deliberate portions. Patricia would inherit the largest slice not just because of her years, but because she had held the empire together through storms that would have sunk lesser captains. Maria would receive property, not just a house, but a sanctuary, a roof that could never again leak over her head. Tommy would be entrusted with the patents, the code that was the beating heart of the company, the gift of creation passed from one builder to another. Each line was written with intent, each clause a judgment. Loyalty was rewarded, betrayal was erased. He paused often, not from weakness, but from reflection, replaying memories like courtroom exhibits. Patricia sleeping in the office during tax audits, Maria cooking for interns on nights they couldn't afford dinner, Tommy coding through power outages with nothing but a flashlight balanced on his shoulder. These weren't employees. They were family, forged in fire. They deserved more than words of thanks. They deserved to own the legacy they had protected. The son's name appeared on the page only once. Not in glory, not in inheritance, but as a footnote. A token sum not enough to sustain his excess, just enough to remind him that his father had remembered him and judged him unworthy. The figure was deliberate, chosen not out of cruelty, but as a symbol. 50,000. The same amount the father had once scraped together in desperation to cover his son's first failed business venture, the one he never repaid, the one he mocked as pocket change. Let him see the number again, carved into law, a mirror of his failure and his greed. The father's lips curled into a thin smile as he pressed the pen harder against the page. Power surged through him with every signature, every date, every initial. For days he had been trapped, reduced to weakness, dependent on nurses and prayers. But now, hunched over paper, he felt like a general redrawing the map of a war. He was reclaiming territory stolen by arrogance, fortifying borders with loyalty, striking down entitlement with ink. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to quicken as though even the machines understood the shift. This was no longer despair. This was strategy. The lawyer arrived, discreetly summoned, not with fanfare but with a single whispered call. He wore the cautious expression of a man who knew secrets were being written in bloodless battles. They reviewed each clause, each allocation, the father's voice steady, his eyes sharper than they had been in years. The lawyer hesitated only once at the line reducing the son's inheritance to nearly nothing. "Are you certain?" the man asked softly. The father's reply was ice. "I have never been more certain in my life." The document was notarized, sealed, bound in leather. The lawyer slid it into his briefcase like contraband, his eyes meeting the father's in silent understanding. When he left the room, the father lay back against the pillows, exhausted but electrified. He had just altered the course of generations, rewritten the very DNA of his empire. The despair was gone now, replaced by a cold fire. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to beg. His son's betrayal had been loud, performed for cameras and champagne flutes. His response would be quiet, calculated, devastating. When the day came when the will was read, the empire would not fall into the hands of an heir waiting for him to die. It would rise in the hands of those who had kept him alive. Outside, dawn was breaking, pale light spilling through the hospital blinds. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to imagine. The son standing in a crowded room waiting for his coronation. The lawyer unfolding the document, reading names the son never expected. Patricia, Maria, Tommy. The silence that would follow. The outrage, the humiliation. The legacy slipping through greedy fingers like sand. The father inhaled deeply, the oxygen mask cold against his face. For the first time since the betrayal began, he felt alive. Not because his body was healing, but because his will, both the document and the force of his resolve, was stronger than ever. This was no longer about survival. It was about justice. And justice had been written in ink. The curtain was only half drawn. The audience didn't know it yet. The next act was coming, and when it arrived, it would crush illusions, rewrite destinies, and prove that legacy belongs only to the loyal. The call was made in the dead of night, his voice low but steady, carrying a gravity that even the attorney on the other end could feel through the line. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and faint machine oil, but the silence that followed his words was heavier than either. He spoke without hesitation, laying out clause after clause, each one sharpened to a blade, each one cutting away entitlement as if carving rot from a tree. The attorney listened, scribbling notes in hurried strokes, his tone shifting from cautious to reverent as he realized what was being orchestrated. This wasn't a routine adjustment. This was an execution legal, binding, and irreversible. Every word was chosen with precision. The company's shares, once neatly tied into the son's inheritance, were now divided with surgical care, redirected to those who had earned them through sweat and loyalty. The vacation home by the lake, once promised casually over a holiday dinner, was struck from the son's name and reassigned. The trust fund, once inflated to fuel indulgence, was dismantled and repurposed for scholarships and employee benefits. Each move was a chess piece placed with ruthless clarity. The son had gambled on his father's silence, and now the board itself was being flipped. The attorney asked once more, "Are you sure?" The father's reply was colder than the oxygen line at his nose. "I am done giving to those who abandoned me. Let the law carry that message." Within hours, the paperwork was drafted, witnessed, notarized. The seals went down like final nails in a coffin. The father's signature, though shaky, carried more power than any speech he could have made. The documents transformed his resolve into permanence. Even if his body gave out tomorrow, his decision would stand like steel, unbreakable, immune to pleas and protests. The empire had been redefined in a single night. He lay back against the pillows, exhausted but alive with a new fire. The act itself had given him strength. He was no longer a patient tethered to machines. He was a man who had taken control of his story, who had reshaped the ending with nothing but ink and willpower. The machines beeped in rhythm beside him, and for the first time the sound didn't feel mocking. It felt like applause, but the satisfaction wasn't in the signatures alone. It was in the knowledge of what came next. He pictured the son in his tuxedo sipping champagne, imagining himself heir apparent. He pictured him laughing, unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already been stolen away, that the inheritance he toasted had vanished in legal ink while he was too busy raising a glass. The irony was almost cinematic. The son thought timing was his ally, but time had already run out. The attorney had promised discretion, but the father knew the day would come when the truth would be unveiled. A boardroom, a conference table, the rustle of papers as the will was read aloud. Faces turning, murmurs rising, his son's confidence draining with every name he didn't hear. Patricia, Maria, Tommy. Names that spoke of loyalty, not blood. Each syllable would fall like a hammer. His son's name would come last, followed by a number so small it would feel like an insult dressed as mercy. The humiliation would be absolute, the betrayal complete. And it would be deserved. As he closed his eyes, he let himself savor that vision, not with cruelty, but with justice. He had been betrayed not once, not twice, but repeatedly, each absence and demand carving scars that no apology could heal. His son had mistaken love for obligation, sacrifice for entitlement. Now he would learn the cost of that mistake, paid not in cash, but in legacy. The father's breath slowed his chest, rising and falling with deliberate calm. He had done it. He had transformed despair into empowerment, betrayal into strategy. What his son had tried to reduce to background noise had become the center of the story, the climax of a reckoning that would reverberate long after the machines stopped. And as the night deepened, the father knew this was only the beginning. The ink was dry, the law was sealed, but the performance of justice had yet to begin. The curtain was ready to rise, and when it did, the audience would witness not just the fall of an ungrateful heir, but the triumph of a man who refused to let betrayal define his ending. The morning of the wedding broke with an eerie, calm sunlight spilling across the city as though it had no idea justice was already in motion. At precisely 7:00 a.m., the father's instructions unfolded like a quiet storm. Corporate credit cards once handed over to his son like toys were frozen without warning. Expense accounts that had funded years of indulgence. Five-star restaurants, designer suits, weekends in Napa blinked out of existence with the press of a key. The banks confirmed each cancellation with clinical efficiency, their voices clipped and polite, unaware that they were severing arteries the son had relied on for years. By the time the groomsmen were gathering in their rented suite, a hotel manager was knocking at the door asking for another form of payment. The son's platinum card, once limitless, was declined in front of his closest friends. Laughter faltered, confusion spread, and a chill crept in where there should have been champagne-fueled bravado. He brushed it off with arrogance, insisting it was a mistake, but the truth began to drip into the cracks of his perfect day. Across town, the father sat propped in his hospital bed, his hands steady on the sheets, his eyes sharp despite the machines tethered to him. He had not needed to raise his voice or leave his room to strike the first blow. Justice was not loud. It was precise, efficient, merciless. Every indulgence that had fattened his son's ego was stripped away in an instant, leaving nothing but the skeleton of entitlement. By mid-morning, florists were calling. The $23,000 order that had once promised cascading roses and orchids now hung in limbo, payment rejected. Delivery vans idled outside the venue, drivers shrugging as coordinators panicked. The caterer, who had prepared enough food to feed 300 guests, demanded confirmation before unloading a single tray. Without payment, contracts dissolved into nothing more than wasted ink. The wedding planner, face pale, scrolled frantically through emails, realizing too late that the financial bedrock of the event had crumbled before her eyes. The son's phone buzzed with frantic alerts, charges denied, vendors demanding wire transfers, the illusion of wealth unraveling thread by thread. He dialed his father, fury in his voice, but the call went unanswered. The silence was deliberate. Every unanswered ring was a mirror held up to 17 unanswered calls from the ICU. The symmetry was brutal, and it was just beginning. Inside the hospital, the father allowed himself a thin, cold smile. For years he had enabled extravagance, excused arrogance, swallowed disrespect because he believed in blood. But now, the same hands that once signed tuition checks and condo leases were erasing those indulgences with strokes of authority. The same son who had ignored his suffering now found himself ignored by the only man who could save him. The reversal was surgical, and it cut deep. Back at the venue, panic turned to chaos. The band refused to play without payment, their instruments still cased. The open bar, once promised to run until midnight, stood shuttered bottles, locked away bartenders waiting for confirmation that never came. Guests began to murmur, confusion spreading like wildfire. The bride's family, embarrassed, pulled the son aside, demanding answers he didn't have. Sweat beaded at his temples as he made frantic promises, his voice cracking under the weight of humiliation. The father imagined it all as clearly as if he were there, the slow collapse of a spectacle built on greed. He pictured his son's face twisting from arrogance to panic, from panic to desperation. He saw the bride's smile falter, saw guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, saw the perfect illusion of a fairy tale wedding disintegrate into a cautionary tale. Every detail was justice rendered cold, not in fire, but in ice. By noon, the son's tuxedo felt like a costume heavy and suffocating. His friends avoided his eyes, his fiancée whispered heated words he couldn't answer, and the vendors began packing up. The fantasy of inherited wealth had evaporated in less than 6 hours, leaving behind only debts and questions. He tried calling again, his father's number glowing on the screen, but there was no reply. The silence mocked him louder than any words could. In the sterile quiet of the ICU, the father let the moment stretch. He had imagined this for days, had crafted it with the precision of a man who built empires from scratch. And now, as the chaos played out across the city, he felt no regret. This was not cruelty. This was consequence. Years of indulgence had ended in a single morning. The empire was no longer a piggy bank for a man who confused inheritance with entitlement. It was a fortress, and the gates had been sealed shut. The machines hummed beside him, steady and relentless. Outside, the sun climbed higher, indifferent to the storm it illuminated. The father knew the collapse of a wedding was only the beginning. The true reckoning had yet to arrive, and when it did, it would not just ruin a day. It would redefine a legacy. The son believed he had been preparing for a celebration. What he was really walking into was a lesson, and the ink on that lesson was already dry. The phone vibrated against the tray table with a violence that seemed almost theatrical. Call after call, his son's number flashing across the screen like an alarm he refused to silence. The father let it ring, the shrill sound filling the sterile room, echoing off the white walls, becoming part of the ICU's mechanical chorus. He didn't reach for it, not once. He wanted his son to hear the emptiness on the other end, the same emptiness he had endured through 17 unanswered calls when his body was fighting to survive. Now it was the son who was left begging into a void. The voicemails came next. His son's voice no longer polished with arrogance, but cracked and frantic. He spoke in half sentences, his tone climbing with each message. The florist won't release the arrangements. The caterer is demanding cash. The photographer is threatening to leave. His words tumbled over one another, desperation strangling the once confident voice of a man who thought the world bent for him. It was the sound of a mask slipping, of arrogance dissolving into panic. Guests were arriving, he said. Cars pulling up, dresses shimmering, tuxedos pressed, and nothing ready to greet them. No flowers, no music, no food. Only confusion, only whispers. The father listened to the recordings later, his face still as stone, each voicemail like fuel poured onto a fire already burning cold inside him. There was no apology woven between the panic, no acknowledgement of betrayal. It was all demands dressed in desperation. Help me. Fix this. Save me. The same commands he had lived under for years, only now stripped of their entitlement, laid bare in need. In his mind's eye, the father could see the scene unfold with cinematic clarity. Guests milling about awkwardly, women fanning themselves with programs, men loosening their ties as tension thickened in the air. The bride's family whispering in tight clusters, their smiles stretched thin, their questions sharp. The groomsmen exchanging nervous looks, their laughter fading into unease. The son darting from one vendor to the next, his tuxedo jacket clinging with sweat, his phone pressed to his ear as each call went unanswered. The arrogance of days past, the wine tastings, the tuxedo fittings, the carefree toasts was gone. In its place stood a man cornered, stripped of illusion, forced to confront a reality he never imagined. Power was never his to command. It had been loaned, and now it had been taken back. The father sat propped in his bed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't revel in cruelty. He reveled in symmetry. This was balance, the scales correcting themselves. For years his son had drained him of resources, treating his sacrifice as entitlement, his love as obligation. Now for the first time his son felt what it meant to be abandoned when the world tilted against you. He felt the same silence, the same indifference, the same crushing realization that no one was coming to save him. The calls kept coming, each one more frantic, until the battery began to falter. The father could imagine him pacing in some side room at the venue, his tie undone, his face flushed with embarrassment. Every ring of the phone a prayer that went unanswered. He could see the bride's parents closing in their voices, clipped, their patience shredded, demanding to know why a multi-million-dollar wedding was unraveling like a street performance. He could see the guests turning, whispers spreading like wildfire, humiliation gathering momentum. The father didn't need to be there to feel the weight of his son's collapse. It was written in every voicemail, every unanswered plea. And still he didn't pick up. He let the silence speak for him, the same silence he had endured, the same silence that had carved betrayal into his bones. Now it carved justice into his son's. By the time the final voicemail ended, the voice on the other end was broken, trembling, barely recognizable. No longer the confident heir. No longer the man posting smiling photos with champagne in hand. Just a boy again, stripped of power, begging a father he had abandoned to save him. The father set the phone down, the screen dark, the room quiet once more. His breathing was shallow, his body weak, But inside, he felt stronger than he had in years. Because this was only the beginning. The panic of unpaid vendors and locked flowers was just the surface. Beneath it waited something far colder, far heavier, a reckoning that would not end with a ruined wedding day. The father closed his eyes, letting the image of his son's desperation linger, and prepared himself for the storm that was yet to come. Steam curled from the rim of the paper cup, the bitter scent of black coffee cutting through the sterile air of the ICU. The father lifted it with steady hands, the plastic lid warm against his lips, and took a slow sip as the phone lit up again. His son's voice spilled from the speaker, frantic unraveling, begging for help with the kind of desperation that once would have broken him, but not now. Now the words were nothing more than a soundtrack to justice unfolding in real time. The son's voice cracked as he pleaded, his sentences colliding into each other. The vendors were threatening to walk. The guests were restless. The bride's family was furious. He promised to fix it, swore he would repay anything, begged his father to release funds, to make a call to save what was left of the day. But the father sat there in silence, sipping coffee, his heartbeat calm, his mind sharp. For years he had heard demands from this voice, had been lectured about what he owed, what was expected of him. Tonight the power had shifted, and the arrogance was gone. All that remained was panic, hollow and raw. The grim satisfaction he felt wasn't joy, it was balance. It was the weight of scales finally settling after years of tilting unfairly. He had sacrificed, bled, built, given everything without condition, and for that he had been discarded like an old coat. Now as his son begged for lifelines, he realized he didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to argue, didn't even need to hang up. Silence was the sharpest blade. Every unanswered pause was a lesson cut into bone. He pictured the scene vividly, almost enjoying the cinematic clarity of it. The bride standing near the altar, her bouquet wilting under the heat of lights, her smile cracking as whispers swelled among the pews. Guests shifting in their seats, checking watches, murmuring about unpaid bands and missing flowers. Caterers refusing to serve so much as a glass of water without cleared payment. The son pacing in the wings phone pressed to his ear, sweat soaking through the collar of his tuxedo, begging into a void while everything he had promised her collapsed in plain sight. The father leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, another sip of coffee steadying his hand. He had imagined this moment differently once long ago. He had thought he might be at the wedding front row watching his son's face light up as vows were exchanged, feeling a father's pride swell in his chest. But pride had long since turned to ash. In its place now was clarity, the kind that cut deep and left no room for doubt. The empire he had built would never be carried by a man who abandoned his father in a hospital bed while toasting strangers. His son's voice cracked again on the line, pleading for just one transfer, just one call to smooth things over. He promised he would repay it. Promised things would be different. The father closed his eyes and let the words wash over him, savoring the hollow ring of promises that had never once been kept. He thought of all the transfers he had made over the years, the debts covered, the indulgences funded, the countless chances handed over like candy. Each one had been met with the same arrogance, the same entitlement. Tonight was different. Tonight the account was closed. The coffee had gone lukewarm when the final voicemail arrived. His son's tone was broken, stripped of pretense. There was no arrogance left, only a boy's fear disguised as a man's voice. He begged for forgiveness, not with sincerity, but with desperation to salvage a wedding collapsing around him. The father let the phone drop back onto the tray, the screen dimming the room, falling back into its mechanical rhythm of beeps and hums. He didn't need to listen further. He had heard enough. The satisfaction wasn't in watching his son suffer, it was in watching the truth finally surface. For years his son had worn masks, layers of charm and arrogance that fooled the world into believing he was worthy. But crisis strips people bare. Tonight, stripped of wealth and pretense, his son was revealed for what he had always been: weak, selfish, incapable of loyalty. And in that revelation lay justice. The father finished the last sip of coffee, his mind already moving past the chaos of the wedding. That was only the surface. The deeper reckoning was yet to come. The will was rewritten, the accounts secured, the empire fortified against greed. His son's collapse today was just the opening act. The true performance would begin when the curtain rose on the reading of the will, when the world would see in ink what blood had already proven unworthy to claim. He set the cup aside, his hand steady now, his eyes sharp with purpose. The machines hummed on, indifferent to justice or betrayal, but he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. The son's begging had been music, not because it brought joy, but because it confirmed what he already knew: the time of indulgence was over. The age of consequences had begun. The room grew quiet again, shadows stretching long across the walls as night crept back in. He closed his eyes not to rest but to picture what came next. The collapse of a wedding was satisfying, but it was only a prelude. The final act was waiting, and when it arrived, it would not be whispered in voicemails or shouted into phones. It would be delivered in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in the cold clarity of legal documents. And when it came, there would be no begging left to do. The sound of polished shoes echoed down the hospital corridor, each step quick, uneven, frantic. Nurses turned their heads as the elevator doors flung open, and a man stormed through, tuxedo jacket, half-buttoned bow tie, loosened hair damp with sweat. His face was crimson, twisted with fury, humiliation clinging to him like smoke. The son shoved open the ICU door without knocking, the smell of wilted flowers and stale champagne still clinging to his suit, the chaos of the ruined wedding trailing behind him like a storm cloud. The father looked up from his bed, calm, still almost regal in the pale glow of the machines. His coffee cup rested empty on the tray, his breathing steady, his eyes sharp. He had been waiting for this moment. The son's voice exploded in the room, shattering the sterile quiet. He screamed about guests leaving in droves, about the bride's parents walking out in disgust, about contracts broken and humiliation etched into every whisper that followed them out of the venue. He shouted about photographers packing up without a single shot, about caterers refusing to serve a crumb, about the orchestra unplugging their instruments while guests stared in disbelief. His hands shook with rage, but beneath it was something uglier: fear. Fear that everything he had built on illusions of wealth and entitlement had collapsed in one afternoon, leaving him naked before the world. "You ruined me," he spat, voice cracking, pointing an accusatory finger at the frail man in the bed. "You sat here doing nothing while my life fell apart. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You destroyed everything I've worked for." The father didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply studied the boy. The man standing before him, dressed in silk and rage, demanding pity where none was owed. For years he had imagined his son's anger might cut him, but now it felt hollow, impotent, the tantrum of someone who had never learned consequence. "You destroyed yourself," the father said quietly, his tone as sharp as glass. The words sliced through the shouting, freezing the air. The son blinked, stunned for a moment, then barked a bitter laugh. "Your money built me. Without you, I'm nothing. And you know it. That's why you've always given in. That's why you'll fix this too. You're weak old dying. You can't take it with you. So stop playing games and give me what's mine." The machines hummed steady as a drumbeat. The father's eyes didn't waver. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until his son's bravado cracked under the weight of his calm. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, deliberate. "Nothing is yours," he said. "Not anymore." The son froze, confusion twisting into disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, voice pitched higher, panicked. The father's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, the kind that carried more weight than laughter. "While you drank champagne and paraded around like a king, I rewrote everything. The company, the houses, the accounts, the will. You inherit nothing but the consequences of your choices, and today you tasted the first of them." The words landed like hammers. The son's face drained of color, his rage tripping over itself into horror. He staggered back a step, shaking his head, unable to process the truth. He had built his entire identity on the certainty of inheritance, on the belief that wealth and power were already his, waiting for the moment his father's breath gave out. Now that future dissolved before him, collapsing faster than the wedding he had just fled. "You wouldn't," he whispered. But the words sounded weak, hollow, more a prayer than a challenge. The father's eyes burned with the fire of a man who had been betrayed and reborn. "I already did." The silence that followed was louder than shouting. The son's chest heaved. His hands clenched, his tuxedo hanging on him like armor cracked beyond repair. He looked at the machines surrounding the bed, at the tubes, the monitors, the evidence of weakness. But in that moment, he realized the truth: his father wasn't weak. Not anymore. The man lying in that hospital bed held more power with a pen than he had ever wielded with all the money funneled into his hands. The son's voice returned, hoarse, trembling with a mix of fury and desperation. "You've ruined me. You've ruined my life." The father leaned back, his strength measured in composure, in the certainty etched into every word. "No," he said softly. "You ruined yourself the day you chose to abandon me. I simply made sure the world saw it." The son stood there, stunned, his world unraveling around him. For the first time in his life he had nothing to say, nothing to demand, nothing to hide behind. His father had stripped away the illusions, leaving him bare, humiliated, powerless. The father turned his gaze to the window where the city lights flickered against the night. His voice was calm, almost serene. "This is only the beginning." The son's fists tightened, his jaw locked, but he could see it now. The empire was gone, the future rewritten, the legacy lost, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The son's shouting rattled down the sterile hallways, his tuxedo sleeves flaring as he gestured wildly, spitting accusations that smelled of panic more than power. His father remained still, his gaze steady, but the noise pierced the calm of the ICU until nurses rushed in. At first they came only to keep order, but the longer they listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't a grieving son lashing out. This was entitlement turned rabid, a man demanding spoils as if his father's life were collateral. Patricia arrived first, her heels sharp against the tile, eyes burning with the cold fury of someone who had balanced his empire for 19 years without ever demanding more than respect. She positioned herself at the foot of the bed, her voice sharp as glass. "Lower your voice," she ordered. It wasn't a plea, it was command. The son blinked at her, disoriented, as though the line between family and loyalty had shifted in ways he couldn't comprehend. Then came Maria, her uniform simple, her hands still red from scrubbing floors, her frame small but unyielding. She moved to the side of the bed, one hand brushing lightly against the father's shoulder, as if to steady him, the other planted on her hip. "You have no right to be here screaming," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years of care. "This man deserves peace, not poison." Tommy appeared next, laptop still tucked under his arm, his face pale from sleepless nights coding systems that had built the empire brick by digital brick. He took his place by the window, arms crossed, eyes locked on the son with quiet contempt. "We've kept him alive when you couldn't even bother to answer a phone," he said, his voice low but heavy, each word striking harder than the son's shouts. The doctor entered, then drawn by the noise, his white coat fluttering like a banner of order in the chaos. He surveyed the scene with a frown, then stepped closer to the bed, his hand raised. "That's enough," he said to the son. "This is a hospital, not your stage. If you continue, security will remove you." The words weren't dramatic, but they carried the weight of finality, and the son faltered, his rage catching in his throat. Together they stood, not family by blood, but family by choice and loyalty. Nurses lingered near the doorway, arms folded, ready to intervene. Employees had arrived on quiet feet, word spreading that their founder was under siege. They formed an unspoken barrier, a human shield around the bed, their bodies angled protectively, their eyes sharp and unwavering. The father watched it all unfold, his chest rising with something that wasn't weakness this time. It was pride, fierce and unrelenting. For so long he had believed blood was the strongest bond, that inheritance flowed naturally from father to son. But here, in the stark light of betrayal, the truth stood undeniable. Family wasn't blood. Family was loyalty. Family was the people who showed up when the world turned cold. The son's face twisted red with fury, disbelief mingling with humiliation. He looked from face to face, searching for an ally, but found only stone walls. Patricia's glare cut him down. Maria's presence made him small. Tommy's silence mocked him louder than words. Even the doctor, a man bound to neutrality, had chosen his side. "You're all parasites," the son snarled, finally his voice cracking. "Living off him, clinging to scraps. He's my father. This is my inheritance." "No," Patricia said coldly, stepping forward. "This is his legacy, and you don't deserve it." The words hit harder than any slap. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with judgment. His father didn't move, didn't need to. The army around him had spoken their loyalty louder than any declaration he could make. The son's fists trembled at his sides, his arrogance collapsing into desperation. But every attempt to regain control slipped through his fingers. The wedding had humiliated him. The hospital had rejected him. Now even the walls that once represented his future closed against him. The father inhaled slowly, the machine steady at his side, and looked at his son one last time with eyes that no longer pleaded or questioned. They judged, they condemned, and they dismissed. The son stumbled back, choking on his own fury, his tuxedo hanging heavy like chains. He had come to the hospital to demand power, to shout his way into control. Instead, he walked into a fortress where loyalty had drawn its line. The shield around the father did not break, did not bend. It stood unyielding, a living testament to what he had built, not in his son, but in those who had chosen to stand by him when it mattered most. And as the son fled the room, the father knew the war was not over. This was merely another battle won, and the reckoning was still gathering on the horizon. The son's rage, once sputtering and wild, hardened into calculation. His voice dropped lower, colder, carrying the venom of a man cornered and desperate. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, tried to gather what dignity remained, and hissed that he would take this to court. He would challenge the documents, the transfers, the will. He would claim his father was weak, confused, manipulated in his fragile state. He spoke of capacity, of law, of judges who would see through what he called exploitation. It was the last card in his deck, and he laid it down with trembling hands as if the threat itself might reverse the tide. For a moment the room stilled. Nurses exchanged glances. Maria's lips pressed into a thin line. Patricia's eyes narrowed, recognizing the tactic, not as strength, but as cowardice wrapped in legal jargon. Tommy shifted closer to the bed, ready to shield again if needed. The air thickened with the weight of the accusation. If the father were to falter, if doubt crept in, the entire fortress could be shaken. Then the doctor stepped forward. His presence was quiet authority, his white coat glowing under the harsh hospital lights. He looked first at the son, then at the father, and finally at the room full of witnesses. His voice, calm but unyielding, cut through the tension like a scalpel. "Your father is fully lucid," the doctor said. "He has been examined. His cognitive function is intact. He understands his decisions with clarity sharper than most men half his age. I would sign that statement under oath." The son's face twisted, the blood draining from it as though the words had struck him physically. He stammered, tried to protest, but the doctor raised a hand, silencing him. "Be very careful with what you claim here. This man is not confused. He is not weak of mind. He has chosen, and his choices stand." The shift in the room was immediate. What had moments earlier been a battlefield teetering on chaos now tilted entirely against the son. Patricia's shoulders squared with vindication. Maria's eyes glistened with relief, her grip on the father's arm tightening with protective pride. Tommy's smirk was quiet but lethal, a silent verdict passed without a word. Even the nurses who had remained neutral leaned subtly closer to the father, their stances declaring where they believed the truth lived. The father himself remained still, his breathing slow, his eyes locked on his son. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to defend. The truth had been spoken by a man bound by oath and profession, a truth that not even the loudest threats could dismantle. The son sputtered, his threats unraveling into incoherence. He spoke of unfairness, of betrayal, of conspiracies against him. But every word was thinner than the last, every sentence bouncing off walls that no longer held an audience. The room wasn't his anymore. It had shifted fully to the father's side, and he stood isolated, stripped of power, his tuxedo nothing more than a costume of a failed performance. The father finally spoke, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of years of sacrifice and betrayal. "You speak of law as though it will save you," he said. "But law is not on the side of greed. Law is on the side of truth. And truth has already spoken." The silence after those words was suffocating. The son's mouth opened, then closed again. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for support, but found none. Even the staff strangers bound to professionalism offered him nothing but stone expressions. He was alone utterly and completely. The father leaned back into his pillows, his strength measured not in muscle but in command. He had turned his son's last weapon into dust without lifting a hand. The will was safe, the decisions binding, the legacy secured. More than that, the truth had been spoken in front of witnesses who would never forget. No courtroom could undo what had just been carved into memory. The son's hands shook as he straightened his cuffs, his arrogance reduced to ashes, his threats collapsing under the weight of reality. He muttered something about leaving, about returning with lawyers, but the words carried no conviction. He turned toward the door, his shoulders hunched, the back of his tuxedo stained with sweat. He looked less like an heir and more like a boy who had been scolded undone, not by cruelty but by truth too heavy to bear. The father watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. The room exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. The doctor adjusted the machines. Patricia whispered reassurance. Maria pressed a cloth to the father's brow. Tommy sat back down with his laptop. The fortress was intact. The father closed his eyes for a moment, not from weakness but from reflection. Justice had been confirmed, not in secret signatures or hidden maneuvers, but in the open light in front of witnesses, through the clarity of truth itself. His son had threatened law, but the law was already on his side. His son had threatened doubt, but the truth had already burned doubt to ash. He opened his eyes again, sharper, colder, steady as steel. The reckoning was not finished. The son would fight, scramble, try to salvage what had already been stripped. But the father was ready. He had seen the battlefield, had watched loyalty form a shield, had felt truth itself stand guard. The war for legacy was far from over, but the son's defeat had already begun, and the next strike would be final. The boardroom was filled to capacity, a collision of worlds that rarely crossed paths. Executives in tailored suits lined one side of the table, their eyes cold and calculating, while rank-and-file employees clustered near the back, their faces hardened by months of whispered rumors. On the opposite wall sat the bride's family, pearls and cufflinks, catching the sterile light, their expressions already tight with embarrassment. The father had chosen this stage carefully. The confrontation was not private, not whispered behind closed doors. It would be public, undeniable, a reckoning carved into memory. At the head of the table, he sat in his wheelchair, tubes removed, his body still frail, but his presence ironclad. He had insisted on leaving the hospital for this moment, against the advice of doctors, because some truths required witnesses. His hands rested on a stack of documents, his gaze steady as the murmurs settled into silence. The son burst into the room a moment later, tuxedo exchanged for a wrinkled suit, his hair unkempt, his eyes bloodshot. He still carried the stench of humiliation from the collapsed wedding, but he wore arrogance like armor, forcing his voice to sound strong. "This is absurd," he announced, glaring at the assembled crowd. "You all know who I am. You all know who I'll be when he's gone. None of this changes the fact that I'm the rightful heir." The father let the words hang in the air, poisonous and empty. Then he leaned forward, his voice sharp enough to cut through steel. Heirship is not claimed by title. It is proven by presence. He gestured toward Patricia, who rose with calm authority, a ledger in her hand. On the night he was admitted to the ICU, she began, "We called his son 17 times. Not once did he answer. Not once did he appear. Instead, he was photographed at wine tastings, tuxedo fittings, and bachelor parties. These are the records." She placed the hospital call logs on the table, their timestamps like nails in a coffin. Gasps rippled through the room as photographs and social media posts were laid beside them. The contrast undeniable. Maria stepped forward next, her voice steady, humble, but unshakable. "While his son was gone, we came. Every day. We brought him food, prayers, company. We sat at his bedside when no one else did. We didn't ask for recognition. We came because loyalty doesn't need an audience." Her words, simple and unpolished, carried more weight than the son's practiced arrogance ever had. Tommy lifted his laptop, projecting security footage onto the screen at the end of the room. The grainy video played in silence, showing employees rotating through night shifts at the hospital, their presence constant, unwavering. Then came the juxtaposition footage of the son laughing in bars, raising champagne glasses, stumbling into limousines. The timeline was inescapable, betrayal carved into hours, minutes, seconds. The bride's parents stiffened in their seats, their eyes darting between the evidence and their daughter's pale face. They had heard whispers, but seeing it laid out in cold clarity was different. The bride herself lowered her gaze, shame spreading across her features as she realized the man she had defended had been unmasked before everyone. The son tried to shout, tried to wave it off as lies, manipulation, conspiracies spun by those jealous of his place. But his voice cracked under the weight of proof, each denial weaker than the last. The room no longer belonged to him. The room belonged to truth. The father waited until the protests died, until silence pressed against every wall before he spoke again. His voice was steady, his eyes locked on the son. "You had every advantage, every resource, every opportunity. And when the moment came to prove yourself, you vanished. You left me to die while strangers kept me alive. And now you stand here demanding an inheritance you did not earn, pretending loyalty you never showed." The bride's father stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "You humiliated our family," he said, his voice trembling with disgust. "You dragged us into a circus, all while ignoring your own father's suffering. You are no man I want tied to my blood." The bride flinched at his words, but she did not argue. She couldn't. The evidence was carved too deep. Around the table, executives began to whisper, their confidence in the son evaporating. He had always believed the company would fall into his hands by default, that blood was enough to secure power. Now they saw him for what he was: absent when it mattered, arrogant when tested, weak when confronted. Their eyes shifted back to the father, awaiting direction. The father's hand moved to the documents stacked before him. He tapped them once, the sound sharp in the silence. "These are the amendments. They are signed, sealed, legally binding. This company, these assets, this legacy, none of it belongs to him. It belongs to those who showed up, to those who proved family through action, not blood. And today, you have all witnessed why." The son's face twisted, rage boiling over into desperation. He lunged toward the table, slamming his hands down, but the movement only revealed his impotence. Patricia didn't flinch. Maria didn't move. Tommy met his glare with cold defiance. Even the doctor who had accompanied the father to ensure his safety stepped forward, ready to intervene. The father raised his hand, silencing the room once more. His eyes bored into his son, unblinking. "You thought my weakness was your opportunity. You thought my silence was consent. You thought my love was obligation. You were wrong. This moment is your inheritance. Remember it well, because it's all you'll ever receive from me." The words fell like a verdict, and the room erupted not in chaos, but in a collective shift of allegiance. Executives leaned toward Patricia, recognizing her steady hand as the company's anchor. Employees looked to Maria and Tommy with pride, their loyalty validated before the highest witnesses. The bride's family rose to leave their judgment final, their disgust palpable. The son stood alone, his face pale, his fists trembling, surrounded by the very people he had believed would one day serve him. The weight of truth crushed him heavier than any courtroom, harsher than any punishment his father could have spoken in private. The father closed his eyes for a moment, exhaustion pressing against him, but his resolve unshaken. Justice had been delivered in full view, not whispered, not hidden. The reckoning was public, undeniable, seared into the memory of everyone present. And as the son stumbled back, stripped of allies, stripped of illusion, stripped of legacy, the father knew this was not the end. It was only the prelude to a final act that would erase entitlement forever. The father let the silence stretch, drawing every eye in the room toward him. His hands rested firmly on the leather folder, the amended will sealed inside, the weight of it greater than gold. He did not rush. Power, he knew, was not in speed but in precision. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying the iron of finality. "This legacy," he said, scanning the faces before him, "is not measured in blood. It is measured in loyalty, sacrifice, and presence. And today, the truth is no longer hidden." He opened the folder and laid the documents on the table with a deliberate motion. The echo of paper against wood rang louder than any gavel. Patricia stepped forward, her eyes locked on the signatures. Maria clasped her hands, whispering a prayer of gratitude. Tommy leaned forward as if waiting for code to compile, knowing that in this moment their lives were about to change. The father continued, each word cutting through the son's unraveling arrogance. "The company shares 60% go to Patricia. 19 years of loyalty, 19 years of carrying this empire through storms that would have sunk any other. You built these walls with me, and now they are yours to guard." Patricia's breath caught her hands, trembling for the first time in decades of discipline. She nodded once, silent, but her eyes burned with a pride she could not contain. "The house," he said next, "goes to Maria. 15 years of devotion, of tending not just floors and walls, but the people who worked inside them. You gave warmth when there was none, and you kept me alive when my own blood turned away. That home will stand because you kept me standing." Maria covered her mouth, tears spilling freely as murmurs swept the room. The house was more than property. It was security, a sanctuary earned with sweat, prayers, and unyielding care. "The patents and investments," he declared, "go to Tommy. 12 years of brilliance, 12 years of sleepless nights that wrote the future in code. You were never just an employee, you were the architect of tomorrow, and now tomorrow belongs to you." Tommy's jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the laptop he still carried, but his eyes glistened with something deeper than triumph. For the first time, he wasn't building someone else's dream. He was inheriting the chance to build his own. The father paused, letting the weight of justice sink in. Then, with deliberate cruelty sharpened into justice, he turned to his son. The room leaned forward. "And to my son," he said coldly, "I leave $50,000, the same sum I gave to fund your first venture, the one you squandered without repayment, the one you mocked as pocket change. Consider it a mirror, a reflection of your contribution. Nothing. No shares, no properties, no empire. Just the echo of what you gave back to me, emptiness." The son's face blanched, his lips trembling as he tried to form words, but none came. The room around him shifted, the weight of collective judgment crushing him more than his father's voice ever could. Guests who had once whispered about his charm now saw only entitlement exposed. Executives who once nodded at his name now looked past him as though he were invisible. Even the bride's family sat stiff, their shame palpable, their eyes avoiding his like he was contagion. The father leaned back in his chair, his body weak but his spirit towering. "Inheritance is not a birthright. It is a ledger, and you, my son, have written yourself into deficit." The air grew thick, the silence punctured only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. The son's chest heaved, his fists trembling, but he could feel the room no longer belonged to him. He was an intruder in what he once thought his kingdom. Patricia stepped closer to the father, her presence an anchor of loyalty. Maria reached for his hand, pressing it to her heart. Tommy stood straighter, no longer the silent coder in the corner, but a man stepping into his rightful place. Together they formed a new constellation of legacy, one built not on bloodlines, but on truth earned through sacrifice. The son stumbled back, his voice breaking in a whisper. "You can't do this. You can't erase me." The father's eyes locked on him, sharp as a blade. "You erased yourself the moment you chose absence over loyalty. I simply signed what you already wrote." The room erupted not in noise, but in a shift so absolute it felt seismic. The son, once the assumed heir, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale standing in a wrinkled suit. The loyal, once unseen, now stood as the inheritors of an empire. And the father, frail in body, but unbreakable in will, had carved his final judgment into stone. As the son fled the room, humiliation staining every step, the father exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to those who had proven true. Justice was no longer a dream. It was law-binding and final. And yet deep in his chest he knew the reckoning was not finished. What had been signed today was only the foundation. The final act, the one that would echo for generations, had yet to unfold. The door slammed behind the son, the sound reverberating down the hall, like the closing of a tomb. For a long moment, the room was silent. The kind of silence that follows an execution, not of a life, but of illusions. The father sat still, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths, his eyes fixed on the space his son had just vacated. He felt no triumph, no vindictive thrill. What settled inside him was something colder, heavier, but cleaner. The burden of false family had finally been cut away. The employees remained rooted in place as though they too understood the gravity of what had just unfolded. Patricia stood tall, no longer the quiet steward of balance sheets, but the rightful guardian of an empire. Maria wept openly, not from sorrow, but from relief, her tears carrying the weight of years in which her loyalty had been overlooked. Tommy hovered near the father's side, laptop clutched tight, his youthful eyes reflecting both awe and responsibility. Around them, executives who had once aligned with power alone now bowed their heads, acknowledging that true leadership was never inherited. It was earned. The bride's family rose slowly, shame etched across their faces. They avoided eye contact with the father, knowing they had nearly tied their legacy to a hollow man. The bride herself lingered for a moment longer, her eyes soft with unspoken apology. But she turned too, swept out with her parents, leaving behind only the echo of what might have been. The father's gaze shifted back to those who had stayed. He saw in them not employees, not subordinates, but fragments of a truth he had been blind to for too long. Patricia's sharp mind, Maria's steady hands, Tommy's restless fire. These were not roles filled by contract. These were threads of family woven by action, not blood. In their presence he felt the warmth he had been searching for in vain from the son who had abandoned him. He cleared his throat, his voice low but strong enough to command the room. Blood ties are chance. Loyalty is choice. Tonight you have shown me what family truly is. It is not inherited. It is not demanded. It is proven. His eyes swept across them, each face lit with a mixture of shock and pride. You are my family. The only family that matters. The words hung heavy in the air, not sentimental but searing, carved with the edge of finality. Maria pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Patricia bowed her head, her jaw tight with emotion she rarely allowed to surface. Tommy blinked hard, swallowing the weight of a mantle he hadn't expected but was determined to carry. Even the nurses at the back of the room exchanged glances, their quiet loyalty acknowledged in the same breath as the empire's leaders. For the father, the moment was almost unbearable in its clarity. All his life he had believed family was predetermined, that his son, by virtue of blood, was the natural heir, not only to his fortune but to his heart. Yet blood had proven fragile, dissolving at the first touch of greed. Loyalty, however, had been tested and hardened stronger than steel. The son out in the hall left disgraced, his silhouette shrinking as he stormed toward a future stripped of inheritance, stripped of respect, stripped of the illusion of being his father's rightful heir. He had believed legacy was his birthright, but now all he carried was humiliation, the kind that clings for a lifetime. Inside, those who remained drew closer to the Father's side. They did not speak in grand gestures. They didn't need to. Their presence was the declaration. They had been there when he was dying. They had shielded him when he was attacked. They had stood firm when his own son turned away. And now they stood beside him as the true family he had searched for all along. The father leaned back in his chair, his body frail but his spirit towering. He felt a peace he had not known in years. Justice had been delivered not in vengeance but in truth. His empire, once threatened by entitlement, was now secured in the hands of those who had already proven worthy. His legacy was no longer chained to bloodlines. It was alive, breathing in the loyalty of those who had carried him through his darkest hours. The room began to empty slowly, people filing out with quiet reverence, but Patricia Maria and Tommy lingered. They didn't leave because they understood instinctively what the son never had. Family doesn't walk away. They would stay as long as he needed, not because of obligation, but because of love forged in loyalty. The father closed his eyes, the weight of the day settling into him, but this time it wasn't despair pressing down. It was release. For the first time he no longer felt abandoned. He was not alone. He had found his family not in the accident of blood, but in the deliberate choice of loyalty. And that he realized was the truest inheritance of all. Yet deep inside a flicker of resolve remained. This was not simply an ending. It was the beginning of something greater, a legacy redefined, a truth that would echo far beyond this room. The reckoning was complete, but the story of what loyalty can build was only just beginning. The story reminds us that true family is not defined by blood, but by loyalty, sacrifice, and presence in times of need. We often believe our children by virtue of being. Our children will carry our values and stand by us when life tests us. Yet reality can be sobering sometimes. Those we expect the most from give us the least, while those we overlook prove themselves through quiet, steadfast devotion. The lesson is clear. Love and loyalty cannot be bought, forced, or inherited. They are earned one action at a time. For older generations, this truth resonates deeply. We know that our worth is not in what we leave behind in money, but in the values we pass on and in the people who show us respect when we are most vulnerable. Choosing who we trust, who we lean on, and who we call family must be based on loyalty, not obligation. This story teaches us to treasure those who stand beside us when the world turns away, because they are the true inheritance of a life well lived. If this message touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more powerful life stories that remind us of what truly matters.